I'm on TV.
As long as I'm not, I'm fine.
Could turn this around.
We have a special announcement for you. If
Yes.
Linda has some research that she's aware of and wants to share with you the source. So
Sure. One of those things that we just talked about during our accreditation workshop area was on Tony Splitberger's paper, which is the effects of classical education on achievement in the Lutheran schools. If you're interested in the paper, I have put his email address up there. All you have to do is say, I would like a copy of your paper, and he is more than willing to email it to you. I spoke with him probably an hour or so ago, so he's very thrilled to share it.
And
he
what
wrote
is
it for his master's paper. So,
and what does it prove?
it proves that classical education is doing exactly what it's supposed to. If you give, I'll read his conclusion at the end.
Okay.
As one could see, this research was from the very beginning an intriguing avenue on the educational research. This research no doubt has its flaws, but in the very least it showed some surprising results that warranted further study. It done again, and after having compensated for its weaknesses, the findings still showed similar results. Then it was the opinion of this researcher that such data must be published. Such news must be communicated and shared not only within the classical community as validation for what they were doing, but also with the other Lutheran and Christian schools who have expressed interest in the classical model, but just didn't have the empirical data to justify the change. The classical education movement may be considered obscure and underground in nature to mainstream American education, but for those educators who are looking to reform that works, the classical model of education should not be discounted or dismissed. It has shown that it is indeed a noteworthy study for further research.
Excellent.
So.
Thank you. Thank you. Wonderful. So email him and he'll email a copy.
I already emailed him.
All right. Very good. Very good. Well, I hope you are well fed now and not anticipating a nap, because we're about to get back into it. This is the good stuff. So, Dr. Korcok, please.
I'm now wired. And so if you're going to say something you don't want anyone to remember, I have to turn this to orange. So give me some secret signal that this is sensitive material for, you have to have an enhanced security clearance in order to hear it. It is currently orange. Should be green. Why press it so no one would hear what I'm saying? And I will press it green when I jog. You want to do a test?
No, go ahead. I'll test
Okay.
what you're doing.
And you can't see it, but I have to give credit to my wife. She works at Brock University with their learning skills department, and she does half the time working with PowerPoint presentations. So she set up my PowerPoint presentation. If you were watching, they were all color coordinated to the theme. So the first one was black because it was coming out of the darkness, right? The next one was blue, and it started with an ocean theme because the arts were crossing the Atlantic. And this one, you can't see it too well, is blackboard green background because it's at the front of your classroom. She's very interested in the fine details. So I'm going green, folks.
Uh-oh.
Okay. So, that's too loud. I'm going orange. Okay, test.
There
Lower,
you go.
please. Way down. Lower. That's good. Maybe lower. Is that okay? Is that disturbing?
Okay.
Oh, you'll hear me. Don't worry. You will hear me if this thing self-destructs. So that's hardly my Bible says, please, not so loud. Okay, so we come to the present. We started in the 16th century. We've journeyed through to the 19th century. We've looked at the arts under the Luther and Melanchthon. We've looked at the arts under Walther and Lindemann, and now we come to the present. The arts, the liberal arts, sitting in your classroom. What do we do with them? What do they look like? That's a hard one. It's hard because in part we have so much invested in it. I mean, we put a lot of thought, a lot of work, a lot of research into how we understand the liberal arts, and so it's a hard one to kind of step back. However, it's important that we step back and take a critical look at what is and what is not the contemporary Lutheran liberal arts pedagogy. And I say this, and I want your patience. First of all, you have to realize this is very much a work in progress. I don't have the definitive answers on it, but I'm hoping we can kind of find a corridor that we can walk down. And if I say something unsettling or contradicts some established practice, don't take it personally, don't take it as an attack on classical education. Yeah, about all I would ask is that you give me a 15-second head start throwing stones. Now, in discussing evangelical pedagogy, I think it's really important, not just for us, but for all Lutheran educators to put their discussion in the context of liberal education and look at the concerns that are raised by liberal education. Now, we don't talk a lot about it, but liberal education is the dominant paradigm in educational research today. Outcomes-based education, progressive education is a part of liberal education. Outcomes-based education or progressive education is an effort to address the concerns that are raised by liberal education. Now, it's fun to flog at progressive education. It makes you feel good. Mm-hmm. But I think if we want to be positive and really make an impact and a positive impact, we have to be at least familiar with the concerns of liberal education. Otherwise, and I speak this as someone who's kind of been on both sides of the fence, you'll go and talk to these people, or you'll write something, or they'll read something that you've written, and they'll say, what are you talking about, right? And you're not addressing the concerns that they have. Some of the concerns are valid concerns, and some are not. But you have to be able to understand the concerns of liberal education on the whole in order to really respond. Yeah?
I don't want to interrupt you, but it just makes clear. A lot of times we talk about liberal arts education, we say liberal education. But here you mean progressive education.
No, I don't mean progressive education.
Okay, so
progressive education is a subset. It is liberal education has a set of concerns, and we're going to look at those concerns. Progressive education attempts to answer those concerns.
Okay, so by liberal education, you mean liberal arts education?
No, if you go and look in the library, you're going to find books on liberal education. It's not talking about the liberal arts. Though liberal education is the descendant of liberal arts education. In educational circles, right? If you talk about researchers working in education.
Is it a synonym for humanities education?
I just want to know, is this what we're doing or the opponents of what we're doing?
Let's go through it, and I think you're going to see.
Okay.
And so I'm just going to give you an introduction to this. I'm going to give you a couple of decent authors that are really worth picking up so you can put your work in the context, in a broader context of educational research. See, it allows you to swim in their pool with greater confidence that way. Yeah, and unless you're able to speak the same lingo or at least understand the concerns, then when you talk about classical education, it's going to be a foreign concept. As it is, I have to admit, I myself have had difficulties when it comes time for classical education, using that term. I'm a member of the Religious Educators Association, REA, and they have a conference in the fall. I submitted a paper for that conference, and I framed it in terms of classical education. I got a very nice letter back, but the gist of it was they didn't know what I was talking about. They were confused, because I was talking about classical education, and I'm sure they were thinking like classics, in the study of the classics. So we have to be sensitive how that's understood. Now, it would be impossible to give a comprehensive explanation of liberal education. It's a vast field, and there's a lot of different schools of thought that fall under those. But what I'm going to do is frame our discussion, and this is where I go in the book as well, frame our discussion by looking at a few people who are doing some apologetic work. These people aren't Orthodox Lutherans by any stretch of the way, but they do give opening to our Lutheran concepts, and they can be a big help to us in framing our discussion in a constructive way. And some of the concepts are going to be a little bit baffling, but that's okay. If I'm not clear, just stop me. Okay? At first, it would appear that the orthodox nature of confessional Lutheran pedagogy would render it incompatible with liberal education. And this is what we do when we just look at one subset, such as progressive education. We say, well, it doesn't work. It's incompatible, instead of looking at the bigger picture. Our approach, with its emphasis on authority and community and structure, would seem inherently contrary to the liberal aims. Liberal aims are two, and I'll explain these in a little bit. One is autonomy, and one is critical thinking. Now, a number of scholars from conservative Christian traditions have argued that someone like, or people from confessional Lutheranism can construct a pedagogy that's not only compatible with, but indispensable to, the healthy development of these liberal ideals. Now, I said there are two key concepts in liberal education, and they are, first of all, autonomy, and I'm going to explain these at length. And then also, the second key concept is indoctrination. Individual autonomy is characterized by the ability to think critically about issues that are central to one's life. That's the chief aim of liberal education. Now, you see, there's nothing inherently bad about that. That which undermines critical thought is generally referred to as indoctrination. And I want to spend about 15 minutes or so introducing you to those two key themes, autonomy and indoctrination, and how we, as people working with the Lutheran liberal arts, can effect a positive change to that. First of all, autonomy. Sometimes when we think of autonomy in context of popular education or educational research, we think that people are talking about that children or people should be able to do whatever they want. They should be completely autonomous and able to do whatever they want. And there are few who will argue for that. That is what the goal is. However, most current liberal and I emphasize current liberal education thinkers will agree that total autonomy is impossible to achieve, if not undesirable. Everyone is bound to some degree to the constraints of culture. Everyone lives in a series of obligations and commitments. However, most definitions of autonomy seem to render liberal education incompatible with any confessionally based education, because confessionalism, by its very nature, possesses limits that autonomy must deny. One of the key writers that I think you should all read. It was just an excellent book in kind of opening my perspectives up and opening my mind to different approaches. His name is Elmer Thiessen. If you think about the name, you realize he's Mennonite. Thiessen is a big Mennonite name. He's a professor of philosophy at community college in Medicine at Alberta. But this guy, he's one of the world leaders. I didn't pick him just because he's Canadian. Thiessen said, pardon?
Oh, yes.
Right. Elmer Thiessen suggests, and this is his quote, normal autonomy recognizes the importance of certain levels of dependence on others in normal human relationship. It also acknowledges that one may choose to submit to another person, even to God. So he says autonomy demands a submission to God and to one another. His book, by the way, is called Liberal Education and Christian Nurture. No, Teaching for Commitment, Liberal Education, Indoctrination, and Christian Nurture. Teaching for Commitment, Liberal Education, Indoctrination, and Christian Nurture. Now, under this definition, Thiessen argues, which Thiessen argues can be supported by a conservative, or what he says, relatively orthodox tradition such as ours. Individuals can be engaged in mutually dependent relationship with others without surrendering their autonomy. A similar approach can be applied to critical thinking. Brenda Watson is another valuable person to know. She has a book, Education and Belief. She was teaching at University of Oxford in England, and now she's an educational advisor. But Brenda Watson has this line, and she says, proper education should encourage the rigorous use of critical faculties, not for the sake of destruction, as though skepticism were the be-all and end-all, but for the purpose of creating a larger grasp of understanding and commitment both to oneself and for others. Now, if you read that, the wheels in your mind should be spinning, right? You should be thinking, hey, isn't that what I'm after? Isn't that the type of thing we're seeking to engender by the use of the arts? A strong system like what we have, a strong theological system, can be understood as a tool by which the individual evaluates himself, the world in which he lives, his relationships to others, his faith, his relationship to God. Critical affirmation equips a person to properly scrutinize his or her own beliefs. Thus, under this definition, a person can hold passionately to his belief if he's willing to engage in respectful dialogue with those who have opposing viewpoints and be ready to concede the possibility that he might be in error. That's the goal, right? That's not such an awful thing to be striving after. Think of Luther at the Diet of Worms. And it's an example of how someone can hold firmly and passionately to his beliefs and yet at the same time remain open to the fact that he may be in error, unless I am convinced by Scripture and plain reason. Right? He's leaving the door open. But unless you can do it that way, I'm right and you're wrong. Now I want to frame these two concepts, or stick these two concepts into our framework of baptism and vocation. These two doctrines are useful in evaluating the pedagogy's compatibility with the liberal aims of autonomy. I want to say our doctrine helps us answer those two concerns. Recall that Luther's view of a Christian's vocational life is rooted in baptism, whereby a child is born into the community of the faithful. Prior to baptism, one is incapable of exercising any spiritual freedom. We're all born in sin and death, right? We cannot, from which we can in no wise set ourselves free. But in baptism, we're freed from the confines of spiritual darkness. Although freedom is a necessary characteristic of autonomy, it does not free the individual from his commitments to the community in which he lives out his vocation. We are autonomous in that before God, we have complete and perfect spiritual freedom. But this autonomy is balanced with the demands of the divine law, with its associated obligations and commitments to others. So we use our autonomy to willingly submit to others and serve them. The Lutheran theology understands the law as the unattainable ideal. Indeed, in the classical Lutheran phrase, lex semper accusat, the law always accuses, is a reminder that the chief use of the law is not to show others where they're wrong, but to convince the individual of the truth that the law is an unattainable ideal. The law drives the person back to the gospel, which is a source of spiritual autonomy first given in baptism. Now, according to that concept of autonomy, this reflection on the law as the unattainable and the gospel as the source of complete freedom be understood. Through this process, students gain the ability to examine their own vocation and apply their ideals to their own position in life. So think of St. Paul's appeal to Galatians in chapter 5, where you were called to your freedom, brothers. Only do not use your freedom as an opportunity to serve the flesh, but through love serve one another. This answers that concern. This balance between law and gospel is the starting point of a child's formation of the self as an autonomous member of the community. It provides a foundation from which he or she develops the skills of critical thinking. The law is the corrective against the child believing that there's nothing more to strive for. It serves as a constant reminder that the child has an imperfect understanding of the world and his or her place in it. The gospel serves to validate the child's understanding of self as an autonomous individual with transcendent dignity. It provides the freedom required to evaluate options and make decisions that are specific to their unique vocation in the world. The ability to assess one's own life, including one's confession of faith, is an important part of evangelical theology, and a pedagogical model which combines law and gospel understanding with the liberal arts positions evangelical education to equip children with the critical thinking skills that are required by liberal education. How often have you heard that in schools we want to teach children critical thinking skills, right? You hear that all the time. This is what they're talking about when you hear that phrase, critical thinking skills. They're talking about the ability to use your autonomy to assess your position in the world. They can use that.
They do.
People in liberal education.
Some.
Yeah, well, and you have to go back.
Critical theorists don't think that about critical thinking.
You have to go back to the beginning where I said, you have a whole extreme, and I'm trying to narrow it down to say there are those who are not Lutherans who are saying this.
Who we find common cause with.
Good, right.
Okay.
Yes, because you can, it's like anything else, you can find just a whole spectrum of things. But such talk would not be considered revolutionary if we came along and started saying the same thing. There are others who are saying this already. Yeah.
What critical thinking is a term that's thrown around commonly. What do they bring as explanations of what they mean by critical thinking, or what are other terms that they use as synonymous with the notion of critical thinking. In other words, I have not seen, for instance, much Lutheran educators pushing for the idea that there should be any formal instruction at any level of education of logic, for instance. So I wonder, what do they mean by critical thinking?
That is like a perfect segue, Steve. Because
Love to play a role.
I'm now going to take the term indoctrination and use that to define or set it against critical thinking. And by defining the negative, you can understand the positive.
Okay.
Okay? Now, the term indoctrination can be confusing, especially to us. Because when I, as a pastor, look at that, indoctrination, it's a teaching of doctrine. Easy. And when used theologically, that may be so. But when you see the term indoctrination used within the context of liberal education, then it's not just talking about the simple teaching of the faith. Rather, it always carries more negative connotations. In her book, Education and Belief, Watson defines indoctrination as the process by which certain beliefs and values are stamped upon the mind in such a way that a person concerned will not question them or consciously reflect on them. Now, understand, I'm setting this in a context, you're going to find all sorts of definitions of indoctrination. But what I'm again trying to get across is that there are people, accepted scholars, doing work in the field of liberal education who are offering up these definitions.
Who did you say this was?
Brenda Watson. And the book is Education and Belief. And these are doorways that we can grab on or can go through. Bridges that we can cross. Tails that we can grab hold of. Now, there are three factors of indoctrination that almost all authors will agree on: intent, methods, and contents. And so teachers could be accused of indoctrination when they deliberately attempt to prevent critical reflection through the materials that are used and how they teach. Now you can see that, and this is maybe helping to clarify Steve's concern about, her question about what is critical thinking. Indoctrination prevents critical thinking. Some might argue that all catechesis is indoctrination and therefore contrary to liberal education. And there are many who do just that. However, that's not necessarily so. In his discussion on the subject, Thiessen argues that catechesis, or as he terms it, Christian nurture, because he's Mennonite, he doesn't like the term catechesis, but catechesis is an essential component of liberal education. Whereas the definition of indoctrination may be defined as a process that leads to the curtailment of one's vogue toward personal, normal rational autonomy, Christian nurture or catechesis involves a continual process of learning and growing that results in the deepening of one's sense of autonomy, the formation of a person's spiritual identity, and an initiation into a Christian heritage, an inheritance of Christian sentiments, beliefs, imaginings, understandings, and activities. Christian worldview, if you wish to use that term. So Thiessen recognized that his definition of Christian nurture has many parallels in our understanding of catechesis. And while such liberal terms, like I've been using, terms like freedom and authenticity and rational reflection and competence may be foreign to our lexicon, they may, with thoughtful reflection, be used to explain our goals in an apologetic way to the world around us and make what we're doing a little bit more understandable to others. Evangelical catechesis is a lifelong process that involves endeavors to enable the individual to grow in their identity as confessional Lutherans, which rightly understood involves that normal sense of autonomy, that I'm free before God. But I have commitments to those around me. Now, the aims of catechesis have not always been understood in that way. And in fact, if you look at how the early Missourians treated catechesis, you could say, well, maybe they kind of crossed that line into indoctrination, because they were more concerned about just teaching the right answers, not allowing a reflection on that. However, it was not their intent. They believed that this catechetical growth was accomplished by the divine teacher working immediately through the Word as it was taught to the child. Thus, the catechetical process does not begin when a child enters the classroom. It begins in infancy, with parents assuming the responsibility of shaping the child's sense of autonomy by teaching them their commitments and obligations under the law, and the freedom they have as individuals, the autonomy they have as individuals under the gospel. Classroom instruction is merely an extension of that baptismal work. The goals remain constant. That's how our theology of catechesis addresses these concerns of indoctrination and autonomy. Now add the goals of the liberal arts, particularly those of the trivium. In the early stages of formal training, grammatical arts are stressed. In this stage, the primary effort is to teach children the rules of communication and language. The stage may well and does involve memorization, but as Thiessen points out, and this is a good quote, he says, what children want are answers, not doubts, and it is absurd, as it is cruel, to treat children at this stage with a heavy dose of critical thinking. He goes on to say, drill, rote memory, learning from authority all have legitimate and necessary roles in education, especially at the initiation phase, as long as these are part of the overall process of the development toward normal rational autonomy. That's what we're after, right? Anyone disagree with that? Good. I'll give you time. The growth toward normal and rational autonomy continues as students are provided the basic tools of logic, which are necessary for independent thought, teaching students not what to think, but how to think. And with these students, they are able to incorporate the grammatical knowledge they have learned and use it to interpret the world around them. After the students have mastered grammatical knowledge and the logical arts, children are ready to be taught the rhetorical arts, which provide them with the tools to speak eruditely about the critical thoughts that they may have formulated. Emphasis on may. This melding of the lower three arts with an evangelical catechetical program results in a pedagogical model which is compatible with the development of liberal ideals in students. While the terminology is certainly different, and as a dyed-in-the-wool Lutheran, it took me a long time before I could utter these words, just because it's so foreign to our lexicon. This model seeks to achieve the goal of liberal education, a mature individual with a sense of normal autonomy. There's lots and lots and lots of work to be done here. And I think this is where we, as Lutherans, should be way, way out in front. There is an openness to religious and theological discussion in certain educational circles that have not been there before. And I've experienced this. I've experienced where you can actually go into some circles and you can talk about this stuff. Lutherans should be walking through the door. And when I started, I said, I think this is where, if we get some really bright people who are brighter than me to write and think about this stuff, we can make a positive contribution beyond our own circles. And start talking in a way and appealing to people who may be sympathetic and understanding what we're doing, but they don't know it. Yeah.
And maybe you'll be 15-second head start on this one. Maybe not. This at the beginning, you categorized progressive education, outcome-based education, that sort of thing, as a category under liberal education.
Right.
In casting Lutheran education or classical Lutheran education as an approach which meets the questions of liberal education, are we casting classical education also as a category of liberal education, the same that progressive education or outcome-based education?
If you can take some of the definitions that have been provided and say, this is our understanding of the aims and goals of liberal education. Here, and these are established definitions that I've given you, right? They've been put out there and they've been debated and they've been accepted. Not by everybody, but they're accepted definitions. You can say, we agree with these, or we agree with these in these respects. Now, academically, you have a voice at the table.
Okay, so the attempt here is just to engage in discussion.
Exactly. Right. And to because the liberal education is the descendant of the liberal arts days gone past.
Yeah, I understand.
And so we're saying this is how we see it today. This is how we see liberal education today.
But progressive educators set out in the beginning to undermine religious-based education.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
How do you
Because they will say
reconcile
that all religion hinders autonomy. All religion hinders critical thought. All religion is indoctrination. Now, in the past 20 years, there are people who say that's nonsense. That normal religious education, not, Opus Dei or any, some groups, I hope there are no Opus Dei people here. Did I offend someone? No fringe groups of that, they're the exception, but normal, healthy, catechetical formation is essential to achieving to achieving the goals of liberal education. So there are those voices out there. And that's why I gave you some of those books. And these two books that I gave you, there's lots of others, but they also do reference some of the work that's out there. Yeah.
One of the things that I'm wondering about, two questions. First of all, you said, by an understanding of this, and particularly an understanding of our language and what we are doing and how we are fitting into this greater category of liberal education, this will allow us, when we are able to understand the language appropriately and so forth, that we have something to offer. That is, that we can somehow come to the table with something. What table were you thinking? What table? In other words, who do you think that we could find a sympathetic ear and a desire to join us in trying to provide the things that a baptized child needs through education?
There are certainly those outside of Lutheran education who are interested in that. There are. And that's one of the reasons why I ended up in Europe to do my research. I had a hard time finding those people in Canada and America. But I think if you can start framing this discussion in these terms, you're going to find a more receptive ear within Lutheran education, because now you're using terms that I've come across before, and I've taken these theory classes. Well, I've heard that term, and you're saying that you're concerned about that issue. I don't want to wade too much into politics, the Missourian politics here.
Well,
I don't know if that's
so much of that. No, what I'm thinking of is one would embrace the idea of some form of education on the basis of previously, it seems to me, having answered the question, why educate? It's only when one somehow comes to some kind of an idea of what it is that education is supposed to do, that one would be in a position then of evaluating what particular kinds of education might be helpful, beneficial, good, bad, or whatever else. And what I'm wondering is, how do those, supposedly who think they are a part of one large, great, big circle under the umbrella of liberal education, how have they sketched out the answer to that question, why educate? That we would somehow see ourselves as, yeah, we're with you.
Well, you're not going to find, I'm kind of not sure where you're going. You're not going to find like one answer. There are, you know, all sorts of different schools of thought. Can someone help me along?
Well, it seems that, and I'll put this in the context that we were a little bit shy of doing, and that is our Concordia colleges and the education departments that we all so often see there, that they tend to use the language, the educational jargon that is common even outside of Lutheran circles in any educational department. All right, so if we come to them using that same kind of jargon, and yet helping them to see that what they're talking about does fit into the Lutheran theology, I think that's what you're saying, and that we can convince them that there's something which they aspire to, which we can help them get. That in essence we have inroad into our own Lutheran education departments, which till now have shut out class learning.
Better, I could have put it better than that. Excellent. Yes, I mean that's exactly my hope, because I've always, from the time we started the school and started in investigating classical education, and I know this is not unique to me. I hear it from all of you. Is, well, how do we reach out? How do you convey this? You just say classical education, and a big wall of ignorance goes up. And maybe we're not using the right words. Yeah.
I kind of look at this, and maybe I'm like the simpleton. I feel like the real market is the parents. I mean, that's the people. I don't really need to sell liberal arts education to a 60-year-old. We're selling it to the parents. You know what I'm saying? That this idea that what's the best education for a child, or in this case a Lutheran child, but it's the parents decide. I mean, we've seen that explosion in kind of just people deciding to homeschool, you know, and it just came from the ground up where people said, you know what, I want something else.
Mm-hmm. And you're right. There are the parents. And an educator stands with a foot in two worlds. There's the world of education and the world of the parents. And I think they bridge the gap, and you have different communities you have to address. So, and maybe some of well, I don't have anything to say. You know how sometimes you start saying something and realize there are no words to follow. Yeah.
I struggle just because of the philosophical implications of the word autonomy, because it seems so foreign to any kind of Lutheran baptismal theology.
Right.
Because even as a new man, I'm being shaped. I'm not autonomous means I am self-regulated, and this is, you can see it in one of the quotes you had from Tyson, you know, that this person chooses to submit to God.
Well, and that's where you have to understand he's a Mennonite.
Of course I do. But I think that there's certain theological systems that will fit much better with the idea of autonomy, because there's not too much there's not too much space between, you know, a certain bits of Reformed or pietistic theology and autonomous thinking. There never was that much of a gap.
And
so,
yeah, and if we define it, if we have to include spiritual regeneration into autonomy, then it doesn't work.
Well, I would even think, I would even think that the idea of sanctification doesn't fit. Sanctification is an article of faith, and I am being shaped into the image of Christ. That doesn't just mean the beginning. That's beginning all the way to the end. And sanctification is a work wholly of God. Which then you start to get into this idea of, well, then what are we talking about catechetically and, in terms of vocationally? Vocation is something that's presented to me, and God is, and he, I think you said it beautifully yesterday, he bounced back and forth between this idea of being crushed when I see my neighbor, but my old man says, "Now I don't want to bother with it." And so God drives me, and he's crushing me. This is not something I'm going, okay, yeah, I'm going to give me another place,
And I can't highlight this enough. I've kind of only opened the door a little bit. There's a lot of analysis, a lot of thinking, and I think we need some bright people who can raise up some bright people who can really dig into this sort of stuff. It would be great. Right? Yes. I don't want to get stuck on this part. This is only the kind of the 15-minute part I said.
Well, then, I don't know if you want to, you said that by going into indoctrination, we would know what critical thinking is by learning what it is not. Are you prepared at this point to give us a critical thinking of this definition? Rather than that critical thinking is not the process by which certain views and values are stamped upon you. That's the
Well, I think you can just put it in a positive way, the ability to question and consciously reflect upon the issues that are before you. Yeah. I think just flipping it around and putting it in. Indoctrination is the opposite of critical thinking. Okay, let's go on to the next part. And Mr. Chairman, how much time do I have?
Only the Lord knows how long we have. That's good. That was not critical.
Okay. The liberal arts and some contemporary theological challenges. Over the past few sessions, we've looked at how
Lutheran arts or liberal arts?
the Lutheran arts, that's good enough. Or the liberal arts, the Lutheran liberal arts. I have written down the evangelical arts.
I'm critically reflecting.
Yeah, so see, I have this postmodernist approach. The words are what you want them to mean. Right? Throughout the church's history, the arts have proved to be faithful handmaidens to Christian theology. As Augustine recognized, God had preserved the liberal arts to enable the church to grasp the sum total of revealed divine wisdom and proclaim it in an eloquent, persuasive manner to the world around her. A mind properly molded by the arts is receptive to the doctrine that is preached. But the reverse is true. A theological system cannot long survive, and I'm talking humanly speaking, cannot long survive if it's not supported by a complementary educational model. Students will have difficulty in internalizing the prevailing theology. That was Luther's concern with Karlstadt and Münster when they moved to close down the Latin schools. It was Walther's concern when he went head-to-head with rationalist educators in Germany. He fought vigorously with his superintendent, and so did every single one of the Saxon pastors that came over. They were all in conflict with their supervisors or their school teachers over pedagogy, because they saw that pedagogy was going to destroy theology. Medieval scholastic theology died, not just because Walt Luther nailed 95 theses to the Wittenberg door. It died because students were no longer taught in a way that enabled them to understand it. That theological system was utterly dependent on her handmaiden. And when the handmaiden was lost, so was the theology. Her fate was sealed. Confessional Lutheranism, and I think this can be applied to virtually every conservative Christian tradition, is suffering because she is losing or has lost her handmaid, the evangelical liberal arts. Without the handmaid, students have difficulty understanding the basic epistemological principles upon which evangelical theology rests. They lack the tools of learning, grammar, logic, and rhetoric that are required in order to accept, defend, and understand the faith of the evangelical Lutheran Church. And whether they were taught this in years gone past formally or informally, yet they have to have those tools. Now, the history of the liberal arts demonstrates a remarkable elasticity in its form and usage. For example, and we've talked about this, the trivium was rarely restricted to 3 arts of just grammar, logic, and rhetoric. History was often included as one of the arts or part of the art of grammar. Music was included as one of the arts of the trivium. Walther and the Missourians replaced Latin with German. But it's that very elasticity that makes the arts such a promising model for the contemporary classroom. There is a tremendous amount of leeway that can be included as part of the Lutheran liberal arts curriculum. And what's more, both the Missourians and the 16th century counterparts had 2-tier systems that were based on the same pedagogy. The Missourians had their gymnasiums and the parish schools. The 16th centuries had their Latin schools and the vernacular schools. But they all had the same basic pedagogy. They all had the same understanding of what they were trying to accomplish. But they used different subjects. That's how we, I think, should look at classical and non-classical Lutheran schools. There is only one Lutheran pedagogy. I don't care. And it's based on the liberal arts. And it has its foundation, that theological justification of baptism, vocation, and catechesis. But the elasticity of the arts provides for a great deal of latitude. Latin, logic, surely grammar, and the like are all educational adiaphora, so to speak. And by that I mean they are not essential to Lutheran education. This is what it's baptism, vocation, and catechesis that makes Lutheran pedagogy Lutheran. Now, I'm not going to try and address how each and every subject should be incorporated into the modern evangelical liberal arts curriculum. History, mathematics, modern literature, and the visual arts all require thought as to how they should be incorporated. However, 2 areas will serve as examples as to how the Lutheran liberal arts might be adjusted to meet contemporary needs. And those 2 areas will be the ancient and modern languages and the sciences. In the past, the language of instruction was determined by the needs of church and society. The 16th century evangelicals maintained Latin as a medium of instruction because it was, in part, the language of higher education, theology, court, and civil life. There were other considerations as well, but there were the considerations of studying the classics, entering into the language of the classics, understanding the sacred languages of Scripture. The 19th century Lutherans considered Latin essential only for those studying the pastoral ministry. German was their language of learning and theology, and English was the language of civil society. Therefore, what was essential was that German and English became languages of instruction. And they would say this: these are the languages we must have. And they draw a distinction between what every school must have and what schools may have, according to their individual needs. In contemporary American culture, the language of worship, theology, and civic discourse is, in our country, English. Therefore, there is no reason to require as an essential component, and I'm saying this very carefully, as an essential component to Lutheran education, any language other than English. But what about Latin? Now, there are certainly strong arguments for the benefits of teaching Latin in schools, and I really don't have to rehearse them with you, I hope. And I myself taught Latin to my kids when they were at home, and we had Latin in our school, so don't get me wrong when I say anything in this regard. But is Latin an essential component of a Lutheran liberal arts program? Not, is it desirable in certain locations, but is it essential to Lutheran education? We would have a hard time saying it's absolutely essential to Lutheran education. I mean, my ideal picture, and if I could have Bill Cochran's job, is I would have regional Latin schools scattered around the country, and then you could have your parish schools that were there. But I don't have his job, and oh well. If we were to say that Latin is essential to Lutheran education, then it would have to be essential in the two realms of ecclesiastical and civic life. So what is essential is that English be mastered by the students, at least in our country. Regardless of what language is used as the medium of instruction, it is important that Lutheran students be taught to use words well. The success of the Church's catechetical efforts depend on this. Words are the means by which God communicates with us. I often say God could have chosen any number of ways to communicate with us, ways that we couldn't even begin to imagine, but God chose to reveal himself in the words of sacred Scripture. Words are the means by which the wisdom of God, both the saving wisdom of Jesus Christ and the wisdom revealed to men of the world, is communicated. The Evangelical Lutheran Church, along with the whole church in the West, is in the midst of an epistemological crisis because people are losing confidence in words. Under the influence of postmodernism, words are no longer viewed as a means of conveying objective truth. They are subjective construct. As a result, the words of Scripture too often are treated as objects of personal interpretation. The Bible means what I want it to mean. Well, that's nice, but it's wrong. You know it's wrong. And the reason it's wrong is because it contradicts Lutheran epistemology.
Yes.
When we use words, they are sacred things because they are the same things that God chooses to use to communicate to us. That's the message we communicate to children. Lutheran epistemology rejects the thought that words are just human constructs, unconnected with any permanent truth or reality. It maintains that words do have an objective value and that they are capable of conveying unchanging divine truth. For this reason, the Lutheran educator must step forth armed with the first art of the trivium. You know which one that is? Oh, good. We have made progress. And teach students that when they use words, they are using the very tools that God uses himself to communicate himself. Science in the modern curriculum, and this is where I'm going to call on Dr. Beath. The role of science is another area of evangelical pedagogy that requires careful consideration. We need people to sit down to think and write about this stuff. When the Lutheran began their work, scientific disciplines were just coming into their own. They could get away without addressing it. But that's no longer the case. Both the sciences, both pure and applied, are well established as recognized disciplines. And yet, I have not seen, and maybe there is somewhere out there, but I haven't seen a careful, deliberate effort to define the role, the relationship of science within Lutheran education. I don't know if someone else has seen stuff out there. I think it's one of the unfortunate consequences of the Enlightenment that science and the arts tend to exist in isolation. The result is that they are unable to inform each other's development, and that division is exacerbated by a long-held suspicion that science is inherently contrary to the revealed knowledge of God and of creation. Suspicion, that's not reality, right? The result is that the ultimate goal of the liberal arts education, that of the education of the whole self, is never fully realized. By returning to the epistemological assumptions upon which the liberal arts rest, the value of science becomes clear. Recall that the early evangelicals, held to the long-standing tradition that all truth is of divine origin, and that the study of the classic works of literature led to a fuller understanding of the divine author of truth. The evangelicals applied this principle to other areas of study, history and music, providing insight into the nature and wisdom of God. Therefore, they were included in the study of the arts. Melanchthon applied this principle to the study of the human body. In his oration on autonomy, which was delivered late in his life in the 1550s, Melanchthon argued that the study of, anatomy, the study of anatomy inevitably led to a recognition of the wonderful skill of the entire construction of man, and would result in the glorification of God and a desire to search deeper for his wisdom. As Melanchthon so eloquently stated, it is true that this entire beautiful machine of the world is a temple of God, and that the traces of the architect are engraved in many parts of it. This approach helps bridge the gap between sciences and the arts. The knowledge that is gathered from the natural world leads to a fuller understanding of the complexities of creation and therefore divine truth. An evangelical liberal arts pedagogy that fully incorporates a study of the natural sciences would allow for students to learn the relevant scientific research and delve into the implications of the research on their ideals. Accordingly, students would need to be well-read, have a basic grasp of the tools of logic, and be able to enunciate their views with relative coherence. The history of the liberal arts is one of constant change in response to new demands and new areas of knowledge, and it follows that a modern evangelical curriculum would fully incorporate the modern study of natural and applied sciences. Now, Dr. Beath, you started in earlier on the sciences.
Yeah, well, we talk about the liberal arts, and the arts are the abilities, the different things that the mind can do. In the medieval universities, well, continuing on through the 17th century universities, including William and Mary and others here in this country, you had the liberal arts, but you also had the liberal sciences. And the word science just means knowledge. And knowledge was sorted out into three types. Natural science, which is around the knowledge of nature, which includes physics and biology, but also metaphysics was included there, knowledge of the external world. The moral sciences, which included history and law and other things, that was considered the knowledge of man. And then the theological science was the knowledge of God. And the expression theology was the queen of the sciences, which even Luther quoted, one of your quotes, that refers to that. So even in Luther's time, knowledge, the content of the curriculum was in the sciences. The arts were the ability to do different things, different mental faculties. So even I used to be at Mequon, I was the Dean of Arts and Sciences. And that goes back, as most of our titles do, to the classical universities. So properly, a liberal arts education, the content of it is the sciences. Natural science, moral science, theological science, knowledge of nature, knowledge of the external world, knowledge of man, and knowledge of God, which does include, I think, everything you think of. So I think the liberal arts, some of their history, have gone in different directions and forgotten part of their own heritage. But it's interesting, last year at this time, some of you remember Christian Kopf gave a workshop on science and classical education, pointed out that from the early pioneering scientists like Newton and so on to contemporary theoretical physicists of Germany, virtually all of the ones who made the biggest discoveries, including currently, are products of the classical education. Graduates of the German Gymnasium, which even today, you can go to the Gymnasium or you can go to the Technical Institute. But people like, Heisenberg and these others, they were products of the classical track.
Yeah.
So that is part of our heritage, and we can't accept the critics who say it isn't. And I think even liberal arts education has got to be sort of focused on the humanities. And in some circles, when you hear liberal education, they're thinking of humanities. But again, the true liberal arts and liberal science education included science also. But we definitely need to recover that.
For sure. Thank you. Moving on to the very last section, grammar, logic, and rhetoric in the modern curriculum. We've talked about how the focus has shifted in different time zones or time eras. During the Scholastic era, logic was the predominating study of the trivium. In the 16th century, it was rhetoric. In the 19th century, it was grammar. If the liberal arts, particularly the trivium, are to have a role in the modern evangelical curriculum, which of those arts should be predominating today? It may well be rhetoric, because the parallels between the last age of rhetoric, the 16th century, and today are so strong. The 16th century was an age of dramatic change on so many different levels. The church, as a result of the Reformation, was radically transformed. There were new political forces connected with the rise of the modern nation state. Economic patterns were shifting with increased trade. The advent of the movable type press ushered in an age of mass literacy and mass communication. And finally, Europe was confronted with challenges from Islam under the threat of the Turkish invasions. Today, the church again is struggling to find its place in a post-Christian society. Nationalistic tensions are rising and dominate political discussions. Global trade is bringing about new economic realities. The rise of the internet and social media networks have changed the way people communicate, and the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in the West once again is being challenged by Islam. In such a world, there is a renewed need for an educational model that emphasizes the persuasive communication of truth. How is that what form is that to take place? What form of rhetoric, if it is an age of rhetoric, what form of rhetoric will it be? I don't know yet. Regardless of which art is emphasized and how it's emphasized, the evangelical church requires a model that provides students with a grammatical foundation for the exegetical understanding of language, the logical understanding of argumentation, and the rhetorical mastery of eloquence and persuasiveness required for rational debate. The skills engendered especially by the lower three arts are not just valuable to a theologian. Vocation in a global context demands laity also possess enough grammar to speak correctly, enough logic to think cogently, and enough rhetoric to speak persuasively. Inspiration for this model will be found in the past, because going back to the past is in the very nature of Lutheranism. We, of all confessions, treasure the past more than anyone else. Luther set the precedent by going back to the early church fathers to buttress his arguments that they were not new but reflected the scriptural teachings of the early church. The predisposition toward the past was cemented in the Book of Concord. From that point on, the evangelical church looked to the historical documents and the historical figures that authored those documents, especially to Luther, to understand and interpret its mission in the present. The very nature of these presentations reflects that principle. This retrospective on pedagogues of the past, Augustine, Luther, Bugenhagen, Melanchthon, Walther, Lindemann, and others, is not just a romantic recounting of history. It's a call to seek a pedagogy for the present by examining the pedagogy of the past, not just any past. This is not the past of the Church of Rome, and it's not the past of the Reformed Church. This is our past, our tradition, and our pedagogy. Going back to the past will allow modern educators to move forward in applying the liberal arts to an evangelical classroom today. Now, that use of history certainly goes against the current popular educational thought. Of all the academic disciplines, education is perhaps the most susceptible to an optimistic, quick fix solution. A view of the future that we can conquer all just by experimenting, which is ironic when you consider that at the heart of the education is molding the young, and the young is not something that you would normally want to experiment with. However, if educators wander into the past of Lutheran education, they cannot avoid an encounter with an educational model that has prevailed in Christian schools for 1,500 years, the liberal arts. The ideals upon which the arts are based are very old, but it's that quality that makes them so attractive to the modern classroom. These are educational truths which transcend time and popular trends. They've been tested and they endure. They have proven themselves indispensable allies to the church as it seeks to be faithful in its calling to teach. The contemporary classroom presents some interesting challenges to the educator. What form should the arts take in a 21st century classroom? Are they compatible with liberal education? I maintain that lots further study is here, but if we study further and work at it harder, educators will be able to devise ways of adapting the arts to meet current challenges. Don't see that yet. On November 24th, 1534, in the town of Wörlitz. Wörlitz is just northwest of Wittenberg. Luther preached a sermon based on 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 5 through 7. It's called the Sum of the Christian Life. For Luther, that passage, 1 Timothy, encapsulated the sum of the Christian life. It is a love that issues from a pure heart, a good conscience, and sincere faith. Now, this sermon isn't usually included as one of Luther's educational writings, but I think this sermon and this phrase captures the goal of the Lutheran liberal arts curriculum. Embedded in it are the key themes that we've explored. Lutheran education in the context of baptism, vocation, and catechesis. When these elements are combined with the liberal arts, educators will strive to develop in students a love for God and for neighbor that issues from a pure heart in which there is no hypocrisy, a good conscience that's been absolved by God, and a sincere faith that rests not on one's merit, but on the merit of Christ. I suspect that there are a good many teachers who are doing this already. I suspect there are many Lutheran school teachers out there who are doing that. Not because they've been formally trained in it, not because they have been formally trained in the arts of grammar, logic, rhetoric, and the rest of the arts, but because it's a natural extension of their evangelical faith. They do it because whether they are aware of it or not, they too are inheritors of the rich educational tradition of the liberal arts. Thank you.
Yes, we
Easy
do.
Did they have to be easy questions? 'Cause I'm
Howard
tired.
Gardner.
Howard Gardner.
Is Howard Gardner a pedagogue we can talk with? Multiple intelligences, that's a big topic out in education circles today.
I'll be honest, I'm not familiar with it.
All right.
Yeah. Do you think so?
I've thought for some time that part of what I'm trying to revive in the rhetorical tradition would be very palatable to people that follow that, but I'm not sure how radical they are.
Yeah.
I've never really rubbed shoulders with too many of them, and I've read his books, but
It may well be. I mean, if we subscribe to the idea that truth is truth, you know, there are going to be people who kind of bump into it from different angles, and they can add something to the discussion.
Just a thought about the interrelatedness or perhaps the logical interrelatedness in the trivium of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. It seems to me that in our culture around us, we are moving increasingly to a rhetoric simply for the purpose of influence and impact, devoid of anything precise in terms of its underpinning in grammar and logic. Rhetoric is indeed where culture wars is going on today. It is a battle for language. But it seems to me that the nature and challenge of that rhetoric today is such that the uniqueness, the unique contribution that we can make for our own children is to have a rhetoric that is firmly anchored in a grammar and a logic about that grammar that is anchored in a Christian worldview, so that the meaning of words anchors in reality, not simply what we want them to mean and how we want people simply to think.
Right.
And this, I think, is critical in terms of understanding on how it is that we can prepare our young people to live in the world of today and what is more increasingly going to look like tomorrow.
sure. That will suggest the people with whom we can dialogue, because the people who reject logocentrism and foundationalism, we can't talk to.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
The others, we can dialogue.
Yeah. And I think if you have a clear understanding of the principles and the essentials of Lutheran education, that helps identify with who you can dialogue with, or who you want to be wary of, or what you want to do. Any other comments, questions? If you want to get a hold of me, I have a website, drkorchak.com. I love it. It just gives me a rush every time I type in drkorchak.com. But there's an email link somewhere on there. You can email me, or you can just send me a tkorchak@gmail. But drkorchak.com will do it. Okay? Yeah, one more.
I just wanted to pick your brain a little further about the languages thing, your comments about English being one thing that's essential for us. There's a part of me that agrees with that, but there's a part of me that I guess I'm still struggling to identify the importance of a second language to education. Luther talks about the importance of the histories of learning language. It's in the plural, if I recall, languages. And it seems to me that Luther's own vision of a classical education speaks of languages in the plural. I don't recall that he speaks of Latin specifically in that context. Obviously that shows up in the visitation articles, but it just seems to me that a second language, maybe we just have to explore this further. It seems like a second language is critical to a full classical education. Latin seems obvious, but I guess I would propose that German or Greek would serve almost as well.
I think two things. First of all, you have to say when Luther is talking about, what is he talking about? Is he talking about education in general, or is he talking about education as it's going to take place in the Latin schools? Obviously, when you have the vernacular schools and it's just German, it's just German. It's unilingual instruction. And for when I said about the requirements of Latin, or language, I should say. I said, what is essential to Lutheran education? What is it? So you can say, yes, this is Lutheran education. Yes, this school is following the Lutheran liberal arts. And in that case, you can say, well, they don't have Latin, but it is still Lutheran liberal arts, and it's still Lutheran education. Is it desirable to have Latin is a different question. Is it desirable for that particular situation?
Then that begs that other question, for whom is classical education?
Oh, well, no, I'm not going to go there.
You're talking about Lutheran education, you're talking about classical.
Right. And, yeah,
He's talking about the ongoing debate, and this goes back, at least in our history, in terms of progressive education's argument for why it ought to be. And that was this particular point, which at the beginning of the industrial age won the day, and that is that the common welfare of our country does not need or require everyone to become an educated person. We need a mass labor force with different kinds of disciplines, different kinds of understandings in order to man our factories. We need our intelligentsia in the professions and in government to be educated, but nobody else.
Right.
And the classical approach was the understanding that our children, and this is parents talking, our children need to become educated. And they weren't thinking necessarily about what they were going to do to put bread on the table, that education related to making a life, not principally a job in an industrialized world.
and I think, just I'll close on this comment, there was kind of a subtext behind what I was saying, and that this is a model that helps bridge a gap. There isn't just them and us who are doing classical education. You know, there are Lutheran educators, some of which do classical education and some which do not. But regardless, if you don't follow these parameters, then you can't say you're doing Lutheran education. You're doing something else. So it allows to build some bridges across the divide. And if you look at how the Missourians handled it, they didn't go and say, we have a cosmic, you have second-rate education, right? You're not doing Lutheran, all you parishes, you aren't doing Lutheran education. They celebrated it. They rejoiced in it because the fundamentals were the same. Yeah.
Would you say then that if we're trying to bridge that gap, that we still need to be careful not to equivocate with the words that we're using? Similarly, if we wanted to speak to Rome, yes, we both have righteousness. One's infused, one's imparted, and those distinctions are critical as we're talking.
Don't argue.
I'm fully supportive of your position on this.
You would make a good little couple. Thank you.
No,